In a move that would change the tide of the war in the Pacific Theater, Vice Admiral William Halsey Jr. authorized the most significant carrier-based attack the United States Navy had ever performed. In November of 1943, and with a new force of American-built aircraft carriers, the Navy would prove their worth against a heavily fortified Japanese fleet that was already preparing for an engagement. The attack on Rabaul, one of the most important islands in the Solomon chain, was essential to divert attention and forces and protect the crucial Allied invasion of Bougainville. The brutal concentration was also key in finally proving that carrier-based air forces could challenge land-based ones, and failing was not an option. Rabaul. In February of 1943, after a 6-month-long campaign, the first American offensive operation of World War II came to a victorious conclusion when Japanese forces finally deserted Guadalcanal. However important the victory, this was only the beginning of a slow-moving and challenging advance through the Solomon Islands, supported by land, sea, and air forces. In the northwesternmost end of this island chain, the Japanese directed their defense forces to an already existing naval base in New Britain, Rabaul. The township would soon be on everyone's lips. Rabaul, one of 2 cities in the tip island chain that make up the Bismarck archipelago, sits in the narrow St. George's Channel, and it was home to one of the main Japanese naval bases of the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns. The location also had 5 pre-war airstrips. Before becoming one of the major Japanese naval defense bases in the Southwest Pacific, the city of Rabaul was once a picturesque island, located on the banks of one of the region's largest natural harbors. It was this organic harbor and the airfields that interested American and Japanese military planners as both nations geared up for World War II. Even before the grueling attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Army and Navy began plans to establish a base of their own to oppose Japan's threat to the Netherlands' East Indies Islands, and also to use it as a refueling stop for military aircraft headed to the Philippines. By the time World War II was in full swing, Japanese warships and aircraft were staged before being sent south towards the advancing Allies. Thus, Rabaul became the frequent target of air raids by the Marines, as well as the U.S. Army, the Royal Australian, and the Royal New Zealand Air Forces. In turn, the Allies frequently encountered an unwelcoming committee of air groups of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, flown only by Japan's best Navy pilots, as well as dozens of anti-aircraft positions. A new threat. By the fall of 1943, the constant attacks over the fight for the Solomon Island chains began to take their toll on Rabaul's potential and capabilities. By then, a new threat emerged from the U.S. Navy, a new generation of aircraft carriers built to replace the ones lost a year before. Ready to join the offensive against Japan and the Axis, the aircraft carriers were crewed by intensively trained airmen and sailors who learned directly from the survivors of the vicious battles of Midway, the Coral Sea, and the Solomons. Joining the surviving carriers USS Saratoga and USS Enterprise were new 27,000-ton Essex-class fleet carriers and 11,000-ton Independence-class light carriers. In addition, the new aircraft joining the Navy's Grumman TBF-1 Avenger torpedo bombers and Douglas SBD-4 Dauntless dive bombers were the newly developed Grumman F6F3 Hellcat fighter and the Curtiss SB-2C-1 Helldiver dive bomber. While the latest Allied fleet advanced toward the Solomon Island chain, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Theater, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, came up with a new plan to take on Imperial Japan by seizing carefully selected island groups. Despite inflicting only minor damage to the Japanese during modest raids on Marcus Island, Tarawa, Makin, and other small islands throughout August and September, the Navy airmen and sailors gained plenty of knowledge and confidence that would come in handy during their next significant campaign, Rabaul. Meanwhile, sailing from Imperial Japan's main Central Pacific base at Truk Island, 7 heavy cruisers, 4 warships, and a train of troop ships headed towards Rabaul, ready to encounter the Allies. Operation Cartwheel. Operation Cartwheel was launched in the late fall of 1943. It was a joint effort led by General George Kenny between the United States 5th Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and it consisted of a land-based bombing campaign against the airfields and port of Rabaul. After the first raid, involving 349 aircraft on October 12th, bad weather conditions blunted the planned bombing effect. The attacks resumed on October 23rd and continued for a week, culminating in a large raid on November 2nd. That day, 9 squadrons, totaling 80 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers, escorted by Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters, began their attack upon the heavily defended base, targeting their anti-aircraft devices with bombing attacks and minimum altitude strafing. Only 8 B-25s were shot down by enemy defenses and naval fighters, or crashed while returning to base. Amongst the losses was Major Raymond Wilkins, who successfully destroyed 2 enemy vessels while getting too close and under relentless fire. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. Carrier attacks. Rabaul was one of the most heavily fortified ports in the war and considered a dangerous hornet's nest, as its 5 airfields were protected with extensive anti-aircraft batteries. Other than the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, no mission against such an exceedingly protected target had ever been performed using carrier aircraft, as it was widely believed that land-based missions were more effective. The planned bombing of Rabaul was a hazardous mission for both the air and sea crews, and even Admiral William Halsey, who was preparing the Allied invasion of Bougainville, referred to the Japanese cruiser force at the island as, quote, the most desperate emergency that confronted me in my entire term as Commander South Pacific. With the upcoming landings in play, Admiral Halsey sent his 2 carriers, under the leadership of Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, to steam north during the night to get close to Rabaul and launch a daybreak raid upon the heavily protected base. By daybreak on November 5, 1943, Task Force 38 was only 220 miles away from Rabaul and steaming ahead. Meanwhile, several aircraft departed from the recently seized Baracoma airfield in nearby Vella La Vella to intercept the Japanese and provide air cover. Then, at 7 a.m., flight deck crews aboard USS Saratoga launched 33 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 16 TBF Avenger torpedo aircraft, and 22 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. In addition, USS Princeton provided 19 Hellcats and 7 Avengers to the forces in Rabaul. Visibility was ideal as the aircraft approached the island, crossing the southern tip of New Ireland and following St. George's Channel toward their target. As the attackers surveyed the area, they knew they had to hit the jackpot. 6 Japanese heavy cruisers were moored in Simpson Harbor, and other targets, including 3 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and dozens of freighters, were also in the area. Some of them were refueling, and others were riding at anchor. The American pilots had orders to swoop from the north for a fast strike and then bolt back to the carriers, with the specific intention to do as much damage as possible on as many ships as possible instead of only sinking a few. Approaching the island behind the cover of a weather front, Rear Admiral Sherman launched all 97 available aircraft against Rabaul. The daybreak bombing of Rabaul was followed by a raid with 27 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, escorted by 58 P-38s an hour later. The following day, most of Imperial Japan's standing warships left Rabaul and headed to a nearby base to be repaired and stay away from further Allied airstrikes. A severe threat had been neutralized with the bombing of Rabaul, and as carrier crews counted aircraft and airmen after the daytime attack, the top military officers realized how well the carrier-based sortie had worked. Out of the entire force, only 6 American aircraft were missing, while several others set down in the water, bringing the total cost to 9 aircraft and 14 casualties. Aftermath. With only 22 bombs, the Dauntlesses damaged 5 out of the 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 2 destroyers. The harm was so severe that the threat to the American troops approaching Bougainville Island was significantly minimized. However, in the wake of the raids performed by the Allies, the Japanese launched a counterattack series involving 120 aircraft against the American carriers. The force was quickly intercepted, and Japan lost 35 aircraft before they managed to inflict any damage on the U.S. ships. Not only did the raid succeed in protecting the Allies, but the attacks also left Rabaul as an isolated and resourceless outpost, reducing the danger the island posed to the ever-accelerating Allied operations in the Pacific. The carrier raid on Rabaul helped cover the capture of Bougainville and Buka, and finally brought Rabaul into the range of land-based Navy and Marine Corps tactical bombers for the first time during the war. These operations set the stage for the pacification campaign intended to neutralize Rabaul, beginning less than 2 months later on December 17th. The success of the bombing at Rabaul ended the previously strong belief that land-based forces were more potent than carrier-based ones, and effectively trained carrier-based air forces, like the men that bravely fought in Rabaul, are still a stalwart reminder of what exemplary planning, organization, and execution can achieve. Thank you for watching our Dark Seas video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and leave us a comment below. And for more history-inspired stories, don't forget to subscribe to all our Dark Documentaries channels. Also, be the first to know of our newest content by hitting the bell icon.